Well, I'll talk about a specific case study, my country, Azerbaijan. About a week ago, President Aliyev appeared on TV and congratulated people of Azerbaijan with Nuomonės holidays. It's the celebration of spring. He wished, as per usual, the very great things, but then he also, as per usual, blamed some foreign powers. He said, and I'm going to quote, translating from the Azerbaijani, that this campaign has never stopped, but especially during the big international events, this campaign takes on an uglier form. We've seen this already during the Eurovision and now in the run-up to the European Games. He added that the purpose of such campaigns was to overshadow the success of the country. Now, to give a little bit of background before I go into the timeline that I'm going to talk about, Azerbaijan is going to host European Games this summer. If you don't know, and it's okay that you don't know because these games are happening for the first time in the world, they're inaugural games. Rumor has it they were created because President Aliyev wanted to host a big international sporting event. Now, the reason why he's so against foreign actors, which he does not define clearly, is because for many years now, there's been a lot of criticism of the government of Azerbaijan, and especially the way it cracks down on human rights defenders, on civil society activists, on youth activists. And in the run-up to the European Games, obviously the criticisms of how the government cracks down intensify abroad because there's a lot of attention on what's happening in the country. So it was not surprising that in his opening speech, in his celebratory speech, he made sure that he once again mentioned the evil foreign powers, namely you, probably me as well, and many other international organizations based abroad. Now, when we look at the freedom of speech in Azerbaijan, it's been on decline, and this timeline is just for 2014, but something that you should keep in mind is that this has been going on for years now, pretty much since President Aliyev Jr. took over his father's position, because now when you compare the two periods, there's a big discrepancy. And the past few years has been severe because pretty much the freedom of expression in Azerbaijan now is limited to a prison cell, because most of the prominent critics of the country are currently in jail. Authorities have also changed tactics of cracking down. So if before we had a country full of hooligans, now we have a country full of traitors. We have a country, the government, the authorities claim that these people who are currently in jail are evading taxes, that they're abusing their power, and that they're all traitors for us. And yet, if anyone actually is aware of the ongoing crackdown, you would know that all those crimes are actually committed on a daily basis by the actual government itself. And yet, when you look at the people in jail, it's the activists, it's the people who try to shed light on the crackdown, and not the government officials. So I will start briefly. I want to give you a sort of an overall picture, and I will be going back and forth when I talk about this timeline. This is a list, a very limited list of currently jailed activists, and this includes political activists, so members of political parties, leaders of political movements, leaders of youth movements. It includes journalists. It includes a lot of civil society folks who've done a lot of work in the country, especially in the past 20 years, working, educating, raising awareness, and yet they're currently all in jail. So we'll start with the beginning of 2014. Yadigar Sadibov is a member of an opposition political party called Nutildyta, which is one of the oldest opposition parties. And he was arrested in 2013. Now, to give a bit of a background again, 2013 was the year of protests in the country. This was when a lot of regional protests were happening as well. So it wasn't just in the capital, but it was also in the regions. And he was arrested in the town where he lived and where he taught in Ankara, which is the southern part of Azerbaijan. Now, of course, this was also the time when we still had a lot of hooligans. We didn't have that many trainers, but we certainly had a lot of hooligans. And so he was accused of hooliganism because police allegedly found a victim, a war veteran, who Sadova allegedly beat up on the street. Now, Sadova was known for his outspokenness, he was known for his liberal views, and so he needed to go to jail. How do you do it? You accuse him of hooliganism. Now, the funny thing is, along with jailing activists and many other individuals, the legislation was changing as well. So to make sure that you can't really challenge the arrest, the government made sure that it was changing laws in parallel as well. Now, this particular law on NGO already changed over the past few years. It started changing in 2013, and the government introduced a series of critical amendments. And then in 2014, in February, it was finally, the most critical ones were finally approved, and it became enforced. It was enforced. And according to this legislation, as if it wasn't already difficult for civil societies to register, for NGOs to register, it became even harder. And they didn't only make it hard for local NGOs, but they also made it really hard for international NGOs to register their branches in the country. Now then, you have the sentencing. So going back to 2013, when I mentioned to you that there were a lot of regional protests in the country, of course there's a lot of support from Baku itself. Now, one of these regional protests took place in Ismailiyeh, which is a region in the north of Azerbaijan. And the people in this town got fed up by the abusive authority of the local EXCOM, the administrative power. They got fed up so much that they finally decided to burn down the brothel that the EXCOM actually ran in the city. There was a lot of protest, there was a lot of riot, and so to prevent it from spreading into other regions, the government actually sent an army. And it literally blocked all the entrance and all the exits to the town, so no one can go in and no one can go out. Now, many people got arrested during these protests, and among them was Ilgar Mammadov. Ilgar Mammadov was a really interesting figure to arrest because he was actually going to run for the presidency in October 2013. How do you make sure that he doesn't run? You put him in jail. And what you accuse him of course, you accuse him of plotting to overthrow the regime. So he's in jail. So you have one less of a candidate to fight against in the elections. And then you go after foreign programs and international organizations. One of these programs is Peace Corps program. It was very popular in Azerbaijan. A lot of American Peace Corps volunteers would come to Azerbaijan. They would stay there for some time. They would work in local NGOs, and they would mostly be scattered all across the country. And now in 2014, the government decided they had enough of Peace Corps volunteers, and they decided that they no longer need their services. And so the program was closed. So that was the last year of Peace Corps volunteers. All of them left the country, and now you don't have them. Now, aside from Peace Corps volunteer program, they also froze the bank accounts of another American program called American Councils. Now, for us, the countries of the post-Soviet Union, American Councils were a really important organization because they sponsored high school students to go and study abroad in the US for a year, to live with his family, and this was in high school, and to have this exchange experience. So when they were going after all these international organizations, they also went after educational organizations as well, including American Councils. And so because of that, this year when there was a selection process, there were no students who could apply because the program actually didn't run. Right now in the US, there are students from Azerbaijan, but that was from last year. Okay. speaking slightly slower. Ironically, in April, Aliyev meets Secretary General, and he promises his commitment to media freedom. How he does it? By arresting more journalists. Rauf Mirkadirov was a reporter for Zerkala Ayna newspaper, which was a daily paper that was published in Russian and Azerbaijani, and he lived in Ankara for the past 4 years. He reported on Turkey-Azerbaijan relations. He was very critical of the government, but he was also engaged in tractor diplomacy. This is a diplomacy that was initiated some 20 years ago by the civil society actors to engage in discussions with Armenia, with our neighbor who we're in conflict with. So, to make sure that there are less voices outside of the country, Mirkadirov was extradited from Turkey, even though all his papers were in order. And as soon as he arrived, he was arrested and he was charged with treason. Mirkadirov is currently in jail. And then we have criticisms. And we have European Court of Human Rights decisions on the case of Ilgar Mammadov that I just mentioned, the head of the opposition movement who was supposed to run for the presidency. Now, the European Court of Human Rights says that the pretrial detention of Mammadov was illegal. And not only it was illegal, but you, as a planned government, ought to pay him 20,000 euros. What happened? None of that happened. He's still in jail. He was actually charged, and those 20,000 euros, they were not paid. And his name didn't even appear in the list of recently pardoned prisoners by the president. Now then you have this wave of criminal cases against non-governmental organizations that were local, but also all the representatives of international organizations. So organizations like ADI, organizations like IRIX, organizations like Transparency International, Oxfam, and obviously all of their local partners. So when you freeze bank accounts and when you launch a criminal case against one foreign NGO, you obviously freeze bank accounts of all other partners that are at home. So this is all new wave of crackdown because, again, like going back to what I said earlier, if it was just the hooligans and if it was just the members of the political movements who were arrested, now they were going after institutions, they were going after the leaders of these institutions, and they're still going after them. And then Niels Musniks declared that all freedoms are in decline in Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, no one really listened to him, and no one really continues to listen to him in Azerbaijan. Most of these criticisms are actually shrugged off in Azerbaijan by the government. And as if to respond to Niels' criticisms, Azerbaijani government detained one of the most prominent couple in the country, Leyla and Arif Yunus. Now, this couple, they're in their 60s. They've done an amazing number of projects in the country. And Leyla Yunus was the founder of Peace and Democracy Institute, another organization that did a lot of work in building bridges with Armenia. And she's done it for 15 years. It's not like she started it yesterday. So when she was detained, this is in April, she's detained and she's accused of some crimes that she hasn't really committed. She's actually arrested in later, and she's accused of treason, and she's accused of tax evasion and whatnot. And now, they've gone after very important individuals in the country, but they've also gone after youth movements. Now, Nida is a very popular youth movement that was key in organizing a number of protests the year before. We have a huge issue in Azerbaijan of death of conscripts during their military service. Last year, one of the bodies, and by last year I mean in 2013, one of the bodies were returned to their family of conscript, and the family was really surprised by the medical examination because the report said that the boy had a heart failure. Now, he went into military service about 3 months ago, and he was perfectly healthy. The family didn't believe the report, so they opened the body and they saw that the body was completely covered in bruises. They filed a case, and they decided to go public with the case. And Nida decided to pick up the story, and they called on the people of Azerbaijan to take the streets and call on the government to finally take for all these illegal deaths in the army. Because we do have close to 100 of conscript deaths annually who die in non-combat, who die for non-combat reasons. But what happened later, after the protest, these 8 guys, they all were on the board of the movement. They were all arrested on different times. And finally, they were charged in May with quite serious crimes, facing from 6 to 8 years. Now, 4 of these guys have been released. They've been pardoned. 2 of them were pardoned because they wrote letters to President Aliyev apologizing for their behavior and actually bowing in front of Father Aliyev's grave as soon as they were released from prison. And then Azerbaijan assumes the chairmanship of the Council of Europe. And this is the time when we get the worst of the crackdowns in the country. On the day it assumes the chairmanship, it arrests one of the civil society activists in the region. Now, Emin Mammadov was released later, but the day after, Pavis Hashemli, one of the most critical journalists, is arrested, and he's sentenced to 8 years. He's sentenced for his work, he's sentenced for criticizing the government, but of course, that's not what he is accused of. Now, a number of other activists, like Matanet Azizova, who ran a really important NGO that dealt with women issues, which we don't have that many in Azerbaijan. We don't have that many good NGOs that deal with women's issues like gender violence or gender equality. And she was one of the really good ones. She also had a shelter in her NGO. But she is barred from leaving the country. I mean, her family is barred from leaving the country. She escaped immediately after she learned that they might be coming after her. For a while, she couldn't get her husband and her son join her. Eventually, a group of human rights defenders from abroad managed to get them out of the country. She's now safely out of the country with her family, actually. Anand Mehmedi and Bashir Suleymanlı were in charge of this independent election monitoring organization. Now, Anand Mehmedi and Bashir Suleymanlı were arrested right after presidential elections in 2013. Why? Because they were publishing independent reports on the violations during the elections in Azerbaijan. And they did an incredible job because they would work with a lot of volunteers and they would pay a lot of attention to what was happening in the country. Anand was arrested immediately after, Bashir was arrested right after. And recently, just about a week ago, Bashir Suleymanlı was pardoned, but Anand remains in jail. And again, when they were sent to jail, when they were sentenced, they were not sentenced for anything basic. They were actually sentenced for quite serious crimes like tax evasion, like abuse of authority, which were the new trends in going after activists in Azerbaijan. Then in May, again, the president pardons some 175 prisoners, and among the list of political prisoners that were presented to the president, only 5 political prisoners actually walked free. And Azerbaijan continues to go after its critics. It not only goes after journalists, it not only goes after civil society actors, it also goes after bloggers. So internet is not so free in Azerbaijan, turns out, because you can also get arrested for what you do, for what you say online. Of course, Abdul also is not arrested for what he said online, but again, he's put in jail for hooliganism and for drug possession, which is another common thing. Apparently, all of the activists in Azerbaijan are drug users. Apart from I guess if you're a hooligan, it kind of goes well together. Orhan Yubzadeh, also an online activist arrested, he was actually released, he was actually pardoned in last week's pardoning. Now, Ayna Ziyakova newspaper, Margaret Muktadirov, the journalist who was extradited and then later arrested, this is his paper, and it had to stop printing because it was facing financial restraints, and now they're only operating online. Among some of the organizations that I mentioned, India had to leave the country. It was already facing a lot of issues from the government because it was not registered, because some of its staff members were persecuted. And so they decided to finally leave the country, especially after they were accused of sponsoring riots in Azerbaijan. I'm slowing down. Sorry if I'm speaking fast. And it's not, the crackdown doesn't just happen in the capital. You have crackdown happening outside as well. Now, Arzu Geybullayeva is one of the journalists who is based outside of Baku, and he was also arrested, among many other journalists who were arrested in the regions in the past year. Of course, there's a lot of criticism again from the West, especially from Europe, saying that Azerbaijan should protect its human rights, that it should respect the conventions that it has signed up to, but again, the government doesn't listen. Now, in June, a very important list of political prisoners is presented. To this day, according to a number of different organizations, there have been reports on the number of political prisoners in the country. But this last political prisoners report had over 90 political prisoner cases. Now, important note here is that Aliyev does not recognize that we have political prisoners. But another important note here is that Azerbaijan today has more political prisoners than Belarus and Russia combined. And these three people that you see on the list here, Leyla Yunus, Arzu Geybullayeva, and Aliyev, they're also in jail. So the people who actually wrote the report, they're in jail. Also, Arzu Geybullayeva was able to present the report on political prisoners during the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly meeting in Baku. And another intervention here. Azerbaijan hosts these international events because it wants to show how tolerant it is. And yet, as you know now, people who present, for example, at these international events end up in jail. More foreign-funded NGOs, Open Society Foundation leaves the country, NDI shuts down, IRIC shuts down, and actually later in December of 2014, the government shut down the Office of Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, the local bureau. And that was one of the last foreign-funded organizations, entities that were forced to stop their activities. And Sefer Musalli is one of the NIDA activists who was arrested. His sentence is reduced after he wrote a letter of apology to the president. But another blogger is sentenced. And this is a revolving door policy. The government pardons some activists, but then it arrests more. It pardons some people and then arrests more. And it goes over and over. Another really important institution, their accounts were frozen, and they do a lot of media reporting. They do a lot of crackdown reporting. And their office was raided, just like the offices of IRIX, of NDI, and their staff was questioned. And the head of IFS, Emin Hüseyinov, goes into hiding. He goes into hiding because he realizes that after the government went after all these prominent figures, he will be next. Now, about a month ago, it was revealed that he's been in hiding at the Swiss consulate in Baku for the past 6 months, hiding in a small room, pretty much bound to that space because of what the government could have done to him. Hassan Husseini, you don't see the picture, but he was another civil society activist who was sentenced, and he was from Ganja, which is the second biggest city after Baku. And this person was a promoter of education abroad. He made sure that girls got education. He made sure that he would talk to families to send their kids abroad because he really believed in education. Now, they arrested him, they sentenced him, they accused him of hooliganism, and he was also pardoned some months ago. Then we have two brothers, which is also a really interesting case, Faraj and Saraj Karimov. Faraj, they both are members of opposition Musharraf party. They arrested Saraj by mistake because they were actually going after Faraj. When they realized that Saraj was not Faraj, instead of releasing Saraj, they kept him in jail, and a week later they arrested his brother. Now, Saraj Karimov was jailed and sentenced last week to 6 years. And there was no evidence in court. No one can prove why he's arrested. They just said, he's a hooligan. He's the brother of a hooligan. you should go to jail. Of course, they didn't say it, but it's my interpretation of what they said in the court. Elaine spends an open letter. This is when she's still free, and not surprisingly, basically a week later, she's sentenced. Now, originally she was sentenced to 3 months. Her sentence, her pre-trial sentence, was extended, and now her final extension of pre-trial detention time was extended until August. So from the time she's been arrested, it's going to be exact year that this woman has been in jail. A week later, they arrested her husband, Adi Funos, and it's actually, I'll go back to that. A week later, they arrested her husband, Adi Funos, but they put him into a different detention facility. They both were accused of treason, they both were accused of tax evasion and many other charges. Another independent opposition paper, Azadleh, was forced to suspend its publication, again for the very same reasons, because of the financial constraints and freezing of bank accounts. Arzu Geybullayeva, the very same person who authored the political prisoners report, was arrested. He was in charge of one of the greatest campaigns during 2012 Eurovision Song Contest, called Art for Democracy and Sing for Democracy. And what he did, together with other civil society activists, was to draw attention on the ongoing crackdown, but also to draw attention on what was happening during the Eurovision Song Contest, which was a lot of illegal, forced movement of the people from their homes, because the government was trying to destroy their homes to build all this new space for the Eurovision Song Contest. He goes into jail. He is currently ongoing trial. Now, Adi Funos, arrested, as I mentioned, Amy Hussein barred from leaving the country, and so he goes into hiding. Intigam Aliyev, prominent human rights defender, the nicest person in the country, one of the best lawyers in Azerbaijan. He was also known for taking the cases of arrested rights activists to the European Court of Human Rights. He was perhaps one of the only lawyers who did that, and what the government did, they arrested him as well. And they also charged him with tax evasion, with embezzlement, with abuse of authority. So it's a pattern. It's an ongoing pattern. The Institute for Reporters in Freedom and Safety, after their bank accounts are frozen, it shuts down. The list of 98 political prisoners is published, but the government doesn't recognize it. It continues to say that we have no political prisoners. A number of international organizations criticize Azerbaijan, and yet nothing really happens. In the meantime, Leyla Yunus, and you have to take into account that Leyla Yunus and Adi Funos are in their 60s. They suffer from a series of medical conditions, and so her health continues to deteriorate. She's suffering from liver breakdown, and her husband is kept in the most serious detention facility at the Ministry of Security. This is the facility that is known for torture, that is known for very critical conditions, and no one can really go in there. So no one really has talked to him since he's been arrested in August. And then cases as this happen. Ilya Nasibov, he was a journalist in one of the regions, and when he goes to his office, he gets beaten. And to this day, the perpetrators of his beating are not found. One of the organizations I mentioned before, Transparency International, their bank accounts are frozen. Another journalist is arrested. Eric's office is raided and shut down. Saeed Nuri, who is Azerbaijani, but who fled the country several years ago, he was an activist. He acquired U.S. citizenship. And so he came to visit his family, but he was deported. He was first detained, and when the case got big and went into the media, they just kicked him out of the country. And they said, you can no longer come back. So this goes on until the end of the year, and it continues to go on. And this presentation, this timeline is actually available online. It's because I'm running out of time, I won't be able to go through all of it. But the trend is that, by changing the legislation, the authorities have closed all the possibilities for pursuing legislative demands. By going after human rights defenders, the government has made sure that no one is left to protect the rights of those who are arrested. There was also a case of barring lawyers from a bar association, and it already happened in the past few months. By freezing bank accounts, no one can really do anything. So what you do, you freeze their bank accounts so that the civil society organizations and the NGOs can't do any work. You jail journalists so that no one really writes about the country. And you jail critical journalists like Khadija Ismail, who I didn't really get a chance to talk about. But she was a journalist with Radio Free Europe, and she was arrested 2 days after the Chief of Staff made the 60-page presentation on Western colonialism and how Radio Free Europe and Western governments are about to destroy the government of Azerbaijan, and they want to overthrow President Aliyev. By jailing activists, you make sure that there are no campaigns organized to call to the attention of what's happening in the country. So, one last thing. There was a time when Azerbaijan recognized its problems. There was a time when the government recognized that it had political prisoners. In 2001, when Azerbaijan became member of the Council of Europe, it promised to release all of its political prisoners. It also promised to ban any prosecution of civil activists as politically motivated charges. A lot has changed since then. The government of Azerbaijan no longer recognizes its political prisoners. Instead, it calls them traitors. It calls them hooligans. It accuses them of crimes they've never committed. And it managed to silence pretty much most of the existing freedom of expression pockets in the country in the past few years. The imprisonment of these men and women is a sign that freedom was not only taken away from them, that it was not only taken away from their families, but that freedom